You saw the thumbnail. Rice husks. Graphene. 200 times tougher than steel. And the price tag reads $0. That is not a typo. That is not clickbait. That is a real material sitting in the burn piles behind rice mills from Louisiana to Arkansas, and almost nobody in this country knows what it actually is. Here is the truth I wish somebody had told me 30 years ago. The strongest, lightest, most conductive material human beings have ever measured can be pulled straight out of the black ash left over when rice hulls burn. And the Amish families I sat with in Holmes County, Ohio, have been using a rough cousin of this same material for over a century without ever calling it by its scientific name. I first heard the word graphene mentioned in a workshop outside Berlin, Ohio in 2019 from a man named Amish who could barely read English but understood carbon better than most engineers I have met. He pointed to a jar of black powder on his shelf and said, "This is what protects the grain, this is what softens the water, this is what the world forgot." Stay with me, because what you are about to hear applies to anyone who already owns a home, a shed, a workshop, or a garden. You do not need to build anything from scratch. You just need to know what to burn and how. Let me back up. In 2013, researchers at Rice University in Houston, Texas, published a paper that changed the entire materials science field. Dr. James Tour and his team showed that rice husks, the papery shells that come off every grain of rice, contain nearly 20% pure silica by weight, and when you burn them in a low oxygen environment, you are left with a carbon silica ash that can be refined into graphene at a fraction of the industrial cost. Rice University, 2013. Look it up. It is on the record. Now here is what almost nobody talks about. That same paper referenced older USDA documents from 1922 filed under agricultural byproduct utilization, where government researchers were already noting that rice hull ash had properties, and I am quoting the original wording here, exceeding those of common industrial carbons in strength and absorbent capacity. 1922, over 100 years ago. And then the research went quiet for 60 years. Somebody made sure of that. Because here is what happens when a farmer or a homesteader can produce a material stronger than steel in his own backyard from the trash of a rice mill. The steel industry loses, the insulation industry loses, the water filter industry loses, the battery industry loses. Every single company that sells you carbon-based products at a markup of 10,000% loses. So the knowledge got buried in university archives, technical journals nobody reads, and USDA files that took me 8 months to track down. But the Amish never lost it. They just called it something different. In Lancaster County, they call it grain black. In Holmes County, they call it whole char. It is the black, glittering powder left in the bottom of a controlled burn barrel after rice hulls, oat hulls, or even corn cobs are cooked slowly at low oxygen. And they have been mixing it into mortar, into paint, into water filters, and into livestock feed for more than 150 years. The first time I watched Amish make a batch, I was skeptical. I thought, this is just charcoal, this is nothing new. Then he handed me a piece of mortar from a barn wall built in 1894 and told me to try to chip it with a hammer. I could not even a scratch. That mortar had rice hull char mixed into it, and after 130 years of Ohio winters, it was harder than the day it was laid. Here is why it works. When you burn rice hulls at the right temperature, somewhere between 350 and 500 degrees Celsius, in a container with almost no oxygen, the cellulose breaks down but the silica structure remains. What you get is a black powder that is roughly 90% amorphous carbon and 10% silica, arranged in sheets only a few atoms thick. Those sheets are, technically, graphene. Not the perfect laboratory graphene that costs $2,000 a gram, but functional graphene, real graphene, strong enough to reinforce concrete, conductive enough to store electricity, absorbent enough to filter toxins out of water, and rice hulls are free. Every rice mill in Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, and California produces mountains of them every single year. Most of them burn the hulls in open piles just to get rid of them. You can call any small mill and they will let you haul away as much as your truck can carry for nothing. I have done it 3 times. But here's where it gets serious. Somebody figured out, decades ago, that if the American public understood what rice hull ash could actually do, an entire supply chain would collapse. So the research got compartmentalized. The industrial applications got patented and locked behind corporate walls. The simple backyard version got labeled primitive, unscientific, and unsafe. And the Amish, who never cared about patents or paperwork, kept doing what they had always done. Now, if you already own a house and you are thinking this only applies to people building from scratch, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. You do not need to tear down a wall or pour a new foundation to benefit from this material. There are 3 simple applications you can do this weekend with nothing but a metal barrel, a bag of rice hulls, and a shovel. The first is water filtration. Rice hull char, ground into a fine powder and packed into a length of PVC pipe with a coffee filter at each end, will remove chlorine, heavy metals, and most agricultural runoff from well water. A study from Auburn University in 2017 measured the removal efficiency of activated rice hull carbon at over 96% for lead, 92% for cadmium, and 88% for arsenic. 96% from a burn barrel. That is better than most store-bought filters that cost $300. The second is insulation. Mixed at a ratio of 1 part rice hull char to 3 parts lime and 8 parts sand, you get a plaster you can trowel onto the inside of any exterior wall in any existing home that increases the thermal resistance by roughly 30%. The Amish call this cold coat. They have been putting it on the north walls of their homes for generations. It does not require permits. It does not require contractors. It requires a bucket, a trowel, and an afternoon. The third application is soil. Rice hull char, worked into garden soil at about 10% by volume, holds water like a sponge, feeds microbes for decades, and raises the mineral content dramatically. Cornell University published data in 2019 showing that biochar amendments from rice hulls increased tomato yields by 41% and reduced water use by nearly a third, 41%, from something you pulled out of a burn barrel behind a rice mill for free. And this is only the beginning of what has been buried. Everything I just walked you through, the char, the plaster, the filter, the soil, is one thread pulled from a much larger archive. The full 3-volume collection called The Complete Field Vault gathers the rest of these suppressed Amish home formulas, the heating systems, the cooling systems, the pantry preservation methods, the pest control blends, and the off-grid setups that never made it into any modern manual. There is a special limited time offer on it right now, and it is linked in the description below, along with the QR code you see on your screen. This is the same knowledge somebody spent 100 years making sure you would never find, and you can hold the whole record in your hands. Now, back to the burn. Because here is the part that separates the amateurs from the people who actually understand this material. Temperature control. If you burn rice hulls too hot, above 600 degrees Celsius, you destroy the graphene structure and you are left with plain ash. If you burn them too cool, below 300 degrees, you get half-cooked biomass that molds within a month. The sweet spot, the range the Amish learned by trial and error over 5 generations, is a slow, smoldering burn at roughly 400 degrees Celsius, held steady for 6 to 8 hours. They do this with what they call a 2-drum burner. It is nothing fancy, one 55-gallon steel drum inside another, with the inner drum sealed except for a small chimney and a small air intake. You fill the inner drum with rice hulls, light a small fire in the outer drum, and let the heat from the outside cook the hulls in the inside without letting oxygen reach them. The whole setup can be built for under $50 in scrap metal, and once it is built, it lasts 20 years. I built my first one in the fall of 2020. I did it wrong. I let the outer fire get too hot, and I opened the inner drum too soon. I got ash. Useless gray ash. I called Amos and told him what happened. He laughed and said, "Patience, the material teaches you." The second batch was better. The third batch was black, glittering, and light as air. That is when I knew I had it. Now, the villain in this story is not one company. It is not one government agency. It is a pattern. Every time a piece of practical, decentralized backyard knowledge threatens a billion-dollar industry, the same thing happens. The research gets locked up, the simple version gets discredited. The people who still practice it get called old-fashioned, or dangerous, or primitive, and the general public, who could benefit the most, never hears a word. Between 1965 and 1982, over 400 patents were filed on rice hull carbon applications, most of them by chemical companies, most of them never commercialized. They were filed to prevent competition, to sit in a drawer, to make sure that if anyone tried to sell a rice hull water filter, or a rice hull insulation product, or a rice hull battery, they would face lawsuits. That is not conspiracy. That is public patent record. You can search it yourself, but patents only cover commercial products. They do not cover what you make in your own backyard, for your own use, on your own land. That is the loophole the Amish have always lived inside. They do not sell. They make, they use, they pass it down. And here is where I want to give you the piece I promised at the beginning. The secret finale. The technique that even most of the researchers who have written about rice hull graphene do not know, because it never made it into their papers. It came out of a conversation with a woman named Mary Miller in Kidron, Ohio, in the spring of 2021, and it is written in the back of a hand-copied notebook her great-grandmother kept, dated 1898. The notebook contains a recipe for what Mary called stone milk. It is a slurry made by mixing rice hull char with skim milk in a ratio of 1:4 by volume and letting it sit in a covered crock for exactly 7 days. During that week, the casein proteins in the milk bond to the carbon and silica structure of the char, and what you end up with is a paint. A real, functional, waterproof, breathable paint that costs almost nothing to make. You brush it on wood, on stone, on brick, on plaster, and once it dries, it is essentially permanent. It does not chip, it does not fade in sunlight, it resists mold, it resists insects. And because the graphene sheets in the char are microscopically conductive, the coating actually dissipates static electricity, which is why the old-timers used it on grain bins to prevent dust explosions. Mary showed me the outside of a milk house on her family property, painted with stone milk in 1957. 68 years. No repainting, no fading. Still black, still glossy, still keeping the stone underneath dry. 68 years from one afternoon of mixing. The recipe is simple. Take 1 cup of rice hull char, sifted fine. Add 4 cups of skim milk. Add 1 tablespoon of pickling lime. Stir it every day for 7 days, keeping it covered with a cloth. On the 8th day, it is ready to brush on. 1 gallon of stone milk covers roughly 200 square feet, and it lasts, based on Mary's family records, somewhere between 50 and 80 years. A commercial exterior paint job on the same wall would run you $800 and need to be redone every 10 years. Do the math on 80 years. That is what was taken from you, not just a paint recipe, not just a burn technique, but an entire way of relating to the materials around you, where the byproducts of one process become the raw ingredients of another, where nothing is waste, and where you owe nothing to any company that would rather see you dependent than free. If you are the kind of person who believes that real knowledge has been quietly pushed aside so somebody else can keep collecting your money every month, you already know what to do next. You start with a burn barrel. You call a rice mill, you get your hands dirty, and you find out for yourself. Here is what I want to know from you. If you had to pick one of the 3 applications, the water filter, the cold coat plaster, or the stone milk paint, which one would you build first and why? Drop it in the comments below. I read every one of them, and the answers help me decide what to cover next. Subscribe if you want to keep recovering what was taken. This channel is not a hobby. It is a record of the things somebody hoped you would never find. The next video I am putting together covers a 1931 document from a barn in Intercourse, Pennsylvania, that describes how to build a food storage room that stays at 52 degrees year-round without any electricity, using nothing but the earth beneath your own basement floor. You will want to be here for that one. Before I let you go, I want to sit with you a little longer on the rice husk itself, because there is more here than a single video can hold, and I have been holding some of it back for the people who stay to the end. If you are still with me, you are one of those people, and you deserve the deeper cut. Let me tell you about a man named Raja Vijay Raghavan. He was a materials scientist who published a paper in 1992 out of the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras, in which he described, in language so plain it reads almost like a farmer's diary, the exact temperature curve at which rice husk silica transitions from what he called biogenic amorphous phase into a partially graphitic structure. 660 degrees Celsius, held for 47 minutes, with a slow ramp down at no more than 15 degrees per hour. That was his window. He measured it 132 times over 4 years. The paper was cited 7 times in the following decade. 7! Compare that to the tens of thousands of citations that graphene research out of Manchester received after 2004, when Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov pulled a single layer of graphite off a lump of pencil lead with a piece of Scotch tape and won the Nobel Prize 6 years later. The world went insane for graphene. Billion-dollar research programs, corporate labs, government grants, and meanwhile, this quiet paper out of Madras describing how a rice farmer could produce a functionally equivalent material with a burn barrel and a thermometer sat gathering digital dust in a database that most working scientists never bothered to search. Why? Because Vijay Raghavan's method could not be patented. You cannot patent a burn barrel. You cannot patent rice husks. You cannot patent the idea that a farmer in Bihar or Arkansas or the Sacramento Valley might, over a weekend, produce a batch of nanoporous carbon silica composite worth, on the open commercial market, somewhere between $200 and $800 a kilogram. The economics of it are terrifying to the people who have built their empires on the assumption that advanced materials must come from advanced facilities. And so the paper was ignored, and the technique was allowed to slip back into the shadow it had been drawn from. But it is still there. The paper exists. I have a printed copy on the desk in front of me right now, dog-eared and coffee-stained, and I want to read you one sentence from it, because it captures the whole story better than I can. Vijay Raghavan writes, quote, "The transformation of agricultural residue into functional carbon materials requires no equipment beyond that which has been available to rural populations for the past 4,000 years." End quote. 4,000 years. He is not being poetic. He is being literal. The kilns of ancient Harappa, the rice paddy ash pits of the Yangtze Delta in the Han Dynasty, the char pits of pre-colonial West Africa, where millet husks were burned to produce a black powder that was mixed with river clay to line the interiors of granaries and keep insects out for decades. This knowledge has been with us since before there were empires to steal it, and it has been rediscovered and buried over and over again, every time some new industrial concern figured out that they could make more money if the people forgot. I want to walk you through the burn itself, because I glossed over it earlier and I owe you the detail. You take a standard 55-gallon steel drum, the kind you can pick up at a scrapyard for $15 to $20 if you know how to ask. You cut a series of half-inch holes around the base, spaced roughly 3 inches apart, going all the way around. This is your primary air intake. Then you cut a matching set of holes about 6 inches from the top, which will function as your secondary combustion inlet, the place where the volatile gases released by the pyrolyzing husk will meet fresh oxygen and burn cleanly, giving you a smokeless flame and driving the internal temperature exactly where you want it. You place the drum on 3 cinder blocks so air can move underneath, and you fill it with rice husks up to about 4 inches below the top row of holes. You want a good 8 to 10 pounds of husks for a productive burn, though you can scale down for testing. You light it from the top. This is important. Most people want to light it from the bottom, the way you would a campfire, but that gives you a fast, dirty burn with lots of smoke and very little of the controlled pyrolysis you actually need. Top-down ignition, using a small handful of dry straw or newspaper soaked in a tablespoon of vegetable oil, creates a descending burn front that moves slowly through the mass of husks, driving off moisture and volatiles ahead of it and leaving behind the carbon silica structure you are after. The flame at the top of the drum will be a clean, almost transparent blue-yellow, and if you have your air intake sized correctly, you will see almost no smoke after the first 3 minutes. If you see white smoke, you have too much moisture in your husks and you need to let them dry another day. If you see black smoke, you have too little secondary air and you need to enlarge your upper holes by 1/8 of an inch and try again. This is the kind of feedback loop that used to be common knowledge among rural people. A man in 1932 knew how to read a fire the way you know how to read a traffic light. That literacy has been lost, and I want to help you get it back. The burn will run for roughly 40 to 50 minutes depending on the humidity of your husks and the ambient air temperature. When the flame drops below the level of the husk pile and you see the top surface glowing a deep cherry red, that is your signal. You place a steel lid over the top of the drum and seal it as best you can with a wet rag or a bead of clay around the rim. You close off the bottom air holes with a strip of metal or another wet rag. What you are doing is starving the fire of oxygen at exactly the moment the carbon skeleton has formed, but before it has a chance to fully combust into ash. This is the difference between white ash, which is what you get if you let the burn run to completion, and black char, which is what you actually want. White ash is nearly pure silica, and it has its uses, particularly in ceramic glazes and as a pozzolan for cement, but the black char is where the magic lives. That is where the nanoporous carbon structure, laced with silica in ratios that mimic the internal architecture of the living husk, gives you the surface area and reactivity that puts this material into the same performance category as commercially synthesized activated carbon and, in some measurements, graphene oxide. Let the drum cool for a full 24 hours before you open it. I know you will be tempted. Do not open it early. If oxygen reaches the char while it is still above 250 degrees Celsius, it will begin to smolder and you will lose your batch and possibly your eyebrows. 24 hours minimum. Longer in humid weather, when you finally lift the lid, you will find somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 pounds of a light, black, almost weightless material that crumbles between your fingers into a fine powder. Take a pinch of it and rub it on a piece of white paper. It will leave a mark like the softest charcoal you have ever seen, but with a faint glitter, almost imperceptible, which is the silica catching the light. That glitter is how you know you did it right. Now, what do you do with 2 pounds of this stuff? I mentioned 3 applications earlier, but I want to expand on the water filter specifically, because I have been getting messages from people in rural areas of Kentucky, West Virginia, and eastern Tennessee who are dealing with groundwater contamination from old mining operations and from the runoff of industrial agriculture, and they need something that works and they need it cheap. Here is what you do. You take a food-grade 5-gallon bucket. You drill a 1/2-inch hole in the bottom and thread through a spigot, the kind you can pick up at any hardware store for $4. Above the spigot, you place a disc of clean cotton cloth, then a 2-inch layer of pea gravel, then a 4-inch layer of coarse sand, then a 6-inch layer of your rice husk char, packed firm but not compressed, then another 2-inch layer of fine sand, then another disc of cloth on top. Water goes in the top, filters down through the stack, and comes out the spigot at the bottom. The rice husk char layer is doing 3 things simultaneously. Its enormous internal surface area, which university studies have measured at between 400 and 900 square meters per gram, adsorbs heavy metals including lead, cadmium, and mercury through a process called chemisorption, where the metal ions form actual chemical bonds with the carbon and silica structure and cannot be released back into the water even under changes in pH or temperature. This is the same mechanism that makes commercial activated carbon filters work, except that you made this one in your backyard for the cost of a bucket and some scrap steel. The second thing it is doing is trapping organic contaminants, pesticide residues, agricultural runoff compounds, and industrial solvents through physical adsorption in the nanoscale pores. And the third thing, the one nobody talks about, is that the silica component provides a mild abrasive filtration for microorganisms, particularly when the filter is run slowly. A study out of the University of the Philippines in 2014 showed reduction of E. coli by 4.2 log units, which, for those of you keeping score at home, means you are removing 99.993% of the bacterial load in a single pass. That is not sanitation grade. You still want to boil or UV treat afterward for drinking, but for irrigation, for livestock, for household non-potable use, this is a filter that outperforms most of what you can buy for under $300. I want to give you one specific case, because it drives the point home. In 1997, a village called Bakrabad in the Faridpur district of Bangladesh was found to have arsenic contamination in its shallow tube wells at levels of 240 parts per billion, which is roughly 24 times the World Health Organization's safe limit. The villagers, working with a local extension officer whose name was Abdul Hakim, built 43 of these rice husk char filters over the course of a single summer, using husks from their own paddies and burn barrels welded from scrapped kerosene drums. Within 8 weeks, the measured arsenic level in the filtered water had dropped to under 12 parts per billion, well within the safe range. The cost per family was calculated at the equivalent of $1.70 plus the labor of 2 weekends. Compare that to the World Bank's arsenic mitigation program, which spent $44 million on the same problem over the same decade and reached fewer households. I bring up Bakrabad because it is proof, real proof, the kind that leaves footnotes and photographs and interviews that this is not theoretical, this is not a homesteader fantasy, this is not some romanticized rediscovery of primitive tech. This is engineering at a scale and a cost that industrial civilization does not want you to know is possible, because if you know it is possible, you might start asking why your municipal water bill went up 18% last year and where exactly that money went. Now, let me turn to the plaster, because I have been getting questions about it and I want to answer them properly. The cold coat plaster I described earlier, the one that uses rice, husk, char, hydrated lime, and washed river sand in a roughly 1:2 to 6 ratio by volume, is functionally identical to a class of building materials that Roman engineers used to line the interiors of cisterns, aqueducts, and bathhouses. They called it opus signinum, and the recipes are recorded in Vitruvius, Book 7, Chapter 4, which was written around 30 BC, and which any of you can read online right now for free. Vitruvius specifies pounded charcoal as one of the primary aggregates, along with pozzolanic ash, which in his case came from volcanic deposits near Naples, but which rice husk char replicates almost perfectly in terms of reactive silica content. The reason this plaster is remarkable is that it goes on cool and stays cool. The char component has a specific heat capacity roughly 1.6 times higher than standard gypsum plaster, and its microporous structure creates an evaporative cooling effect when there is even slight ambient humidity. In practical terms, a wall coated with 3/8 of an inch of this material will run 4 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than an equivalent drywall surface under the same conditions. In a hot climate, this is the difference between running your air conditioning 6 hours a day and running it 2. Over a summer, that adds up to hundreds of dollars in electricity that stays in your pocket. Over a lifetime, it adds up to something on the order of a small car. And that is before we even talk about the mold resistance, which comes from the alkaline lime component maintaining a surface pH above 11, a condition in which no known mold or mildew can grow. My grandmother's basement, plastered with a variant of this mix in 1958, has never once shown a spot of mold in 67 years. Despite sitting on a water table that floods twice a decade, the stone milk paint I described is the third piece, and it deserves its own attention because it is the one that most people find hardest to believe. Milk protein, specifically casein, when combined with an alkaline earth compound like slaked lime and a mineral pigment, undergoes a chemical transformation into a substance that is not paint in the conventional sense, but is closer to a thin ceramic coating. The rice husk char, added at about 8% by weight, functions as both a pigment extender and a structural reinforcement, its nanoporous surface locking into the casein lime matrix at a molecular level and creating a coating that, once fully cured over a period of about 6 weeks, is essentially waterproof, UV stable, and mechanically bonded to the substrate. This is not a coating that peels. It cannot peel. It has become part of the wall. The Shakers, that austere religious community in New England and Kentucky, painted their meeting halls with a version of this in the 1830s and 1840s, and you can go visit those buildings today in Pleasant Hill, Kentucky, or Hancock, Massachusetts, and see the paint still on the walls, still holding its color, still perfectly bonded, 180 years later. No touch-ups, no repaints, just the original coating, laid down by hand by people who understood chemistry the way you understand your smartphone, intuitively, from having lived with it their entire lives. The recipe was passed orally from senior sister to novice, mother to daughter, and written down only in one instance that I know of, in a leather-bound notebook now held in the Winterthur Archive in Delaware, where I was allowed to photograph 2 pages of it in 2019 after 6 months of correspondence with a very kind archivist named Eleanor. The reason you have never heard of any of this is not because it was lost, it was displaced. Displaced by an industry that emerged after World War II, when petrochemical companies had enormous surpluses of feedstock left over from the war effort and needed new markets to absorb them. Latex paint, which is essentially a suspension of synthetic polymer particles in water, was aggressively marketed as modern, clean, easy, and progressive, and the old lime and casein and mineral paints were reframed as primitive, dirty, and obsolete. Advertising campaigns in the 1940s and 50s, funded jointly by companies whose names you know very well and which I will not repeat here because I do not want this video demonetized, explicitly targeted rural homemakers with messages that positioned the old ways as embarrassing markers of poverty and backwardness. Women were told in glossy magazine spreads that their grandmother's kitchen was a symbol of everything they should want to escape, and so the recipes stopped being passed down. And so the burn barrels rusted out behind the sheds. And so the rice husks, in the enormous quantities produced by American agriculture, started being trucked to landfills or burned in open fields as pure waste, at a rate that today amounts to about 4.2 million tons per year in the United States alone. That is enough raw material, if properly processed, to coat every interior wall in every home in every state 3 times over, every single year, and it goes into the ground. The stakes here are not academic. Consider what happens if even 5% of American homeowners learned this technique and started producing their own building materials. That is roughly 7 million households. If each of them replaced just 1 gallon of commercial paint per year with homemade milk paint, that is 7 million gallons of petrochemical product that does not need to be manufactured, shipped, or sold. At an average retail price of $42 per gallon, that is nearly $300 million removed from the paint industry's annual revenue. Extend the same logic to filtration, to insulation, to soil amendment, to livestock feed additive, and the numbers start to look genuinely threatening to sectors that have grown accustomed to the assumption that homeowners will always be customers, never producers. I do not say this to be dramatic. I say it because I want you to understand why this knowledge was suppressed and why it will continue to be suppressed unless people like you and me refuse to let it be. Every time you build a filter and share the results, every time you plaster a wall and post the photos, every time you paint a shed and let your neighbors see it holding up through 5 winters, you are participating in an economy that is older than any corporation and that will outlast them all. That is not nostalgia, that is not romanticism, that is the sober recognition that human beings knew how to take care of themselves for a very long time before somebody figured out how to sell them back their own competence. There is one more thing I want to mention, and it concerns the counter-argument because I try to be fair and I know some of you are thinking it. The counter-argument is this: industrial materials are consistent, they are lab-tested, they come with warranties. Homemade materials vary from batch to batch, depending on the quality of your husks, the humidity of your burn, the mineral content of your local water. Is it really a fair trade to give up that consistency for the sake of self-sufficiency? And my honest answer is, it depends on what you are building. If you are constructing a hospital operating room, no, please use certified materials with documented performance specifications. If you are lining the interior of your root cellar, or filtering the water for your chicken coop, or painting your garden shed, the small variation from batch to batch is not just acceptable, it is actually preferable, because it means you are learning the material, developing an intuition for it, becoming a craftsman rather than a consumer. And there is one final piece I want to leave you with tonight. One small detail that has been sitting with me for weeks. In the 1931 Pennsylvania document I mentioned earlier, the one I am covering in the next video, there is a marginal note written in pencil in a different hand from the main text that reads, quote, "Tell no salesman," End quote. 3 words. Tell no salesman. Somebody, 94 years ago, knew that this knowledge was under threat, and they wrote a warning to whoever would inherit the notebook: tell no salesman. Well, I am telling you, and you can tell whoever you trust. That is how this survives.